I wrote this poem in a writing class to the prompt hair. And what came out of me from deep inside of me that I had suppressed was this image of being 7 years old and, piddling all over the floor because she's kicking me. And I realized I've got a story. I need to tell that story, not because it's my story, but because the story belongs to so many people.
Beverly Armento is a writer, speaker, and advocate for children and teachers. Her memoir, Seeing Eye Girl, tells the story of childhood trauma and being empowered by her teachers. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Beverly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
Beverly, I'm excited to have you here, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
I really think I started out as a writer when I had to face the first big turning point in my life. That was when I was 5 years old. And the scene that is still in my head all these many years later is a big fight that kind of fell into my bedroom where my little sister and I were sleeping. And who was fighting? My mother, my father, and the guy that I called the blonde man. The blonde man had been visiting my mother for quite some time now.
Oh.
And that night, my father, my real father, came home from, the night shift that he was working to find them, you can guess where. And so they were physically pounding on each other over my bed. And my mother was hitting my father, not the blonde man. I was like, a little traumatized. I wound up under the table where my dollhouse had been sitting. Where was my dollhouse? All over the floor. One of them had hit the table, and the dollhouse with all the people and the furniture were splayed all over the floor. That after that event, the lives of those 5 people that were in that room at that time changed dramatically. And that fight had long-lasting effects on everybody. It was a huge turning point. And the imagery of the fight and of that dollhouse all over the floor came to represent for me the trauma that followed and the chaos that followed. And I kept writing and rewriting that scene in my mind. But it took me many, many years before I actually sat down and wrote the story of my childhood. And that's what Seeing Eye Girl is all about.
Yeah.
And it's called Seeing Eye Girl because essentially I was the seeing eye girl for my blind mother. My mother had been going blind with an ailment that affected the corneas of her eyes ever since she was a baby. She's the only one of eight siblings who has this eye disease. So by the time she had me at 19, she was totally blind. But, part of the story is, there are a number of threads in this story. One is that after the fight, almost everybody in that room changed in some significant way. My mother became, I think she had a real psychological break at that point. She became violent and had strange delusional thoughts that affected the whole family. And her main target of her violence was me, because my father had disappeared after the fight, and she took out her anger and whatever torment she had, in large part on me. Some of that was, I think, willful, and some of it was a function of
Yeah.
her ill mental state.
I want to dig into that a little bit more, but I'm curious. I want to go back to just the night of the fight. You are 5 years old.
Right.
And it's really the story of two broken homes. I mean, you've got your broken home, right, which is the home you're living in, and then
Right.
you're this dollhouse. I can't get this image of the dollhouse, this broken dollhouse, out of my mind. I mean, to me, that is just what a metaphor for or physical
Exactly.
representation of what's happening in your home life.
It is amazing metaphor. And I'm using that. I'm writing another book now, kind of like The Life with the Father, because seeing our girls essentially a life of the mother with the mother. But that metaphor for the dollhouse, I agree with you. It is has such power. And people relate to that because you can apply it to your life or anyone else's life. The we spend so much of our life trying to put the pieces back in the dollhouse. The and the furniture changes and the people change. And yeah, I love that
At
imagery.
that period of time, did you have a sense that something was going on with your mom? I mean, had you seen the blonde man before? Was this like something that took you off guard as well, or did you have a sense that there was something kind of amiss with your parents' marriage?
I never actually thought about the marriage. I was 5, but up until that fight, I had a lovely life. My mother and father loved me. For 4 years, I was an only child. All the pictures, and there are many pictures of that time period, I was surrounded by a huge Italian family. We were living in Yonkers, New York. Um, and we were actually living in a place called Mulford Gardens, which was one of the first, federally funded housing projects. But it was a brand new place. And so the apartment was lovely. I thought I had a good life. I had a lot of physical things. I had beautiful clothes. I had dolls. I had this magnificent dollhouse. I thought that, and it was World War II. By the time the dollhouse happens, it's the end of World War II. My real father had been stationed, in the country because I was told it was because his wife was blind. Um, and he needed to be nearby. But the 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 blonde man had been coming for a long time, and when my father came back home from being stationed in South Carolina, he took on a job with Otis Elevator. He worked nights, and yeah, the blonde man kept coming. Even after my father returned from his service. And I didn't like the blonde man. I mean, I knew he didn't belong there. Um, but what does the kid do? The kid just sort of goes along with things, of course. But I never expected, and I don't think, as I look back, I never saw any evidence of a problem with their relationship. I don't think a kid knows what to look for. Um, but whatever was going on behind the scenes between the two of them, of course, it was pretty awful because by the time of the fight, my mother, doesn't like my father anymore, and that became evident in what happened after all of that. And I think the fact that my father left Yonkers, there was a trial. The blonde man was charged with assault and battery. He was jailed. There was a trial. That I didn't find out until I was way, way, you know, old. But I've got the newspaper clippings. These are things nobody's going to tell you when you're growing up. Um, so I've had to discover through my own research on my life, kind of like what happened. Is So I've tried to put all those pieces together and make sense of why my father left and all of that. You never get the full story, though.
Yeah. No, I'm just some families are very good at keeping secrets.
No kidding.
Very, shame gets us all, I guess. So at what point do you think to yourself, I'm gonna take this pain that I had from my childhood, that which I'm assuming followed you into adulthood, just having those experiences, and it sounds like your mother was abusive towards you. When do you start thinking, I'm going to turn this into, I'm going to capture this, I'm going to write this down, and I guess the fear for me there is, gosh, would you have to relive that pain? The flip side, that it could be it could be therapeutic. I'm just curious as to what that journey was like for you, Beverly.
Well, I always thought I was going to write it, but I had such a busy life, I never got around to it. It was in my retirement that I took a creative nonfiction writing class, and I spontaneously wrote this poem. And after I wrote it, I thought, where the heck did that come from? It shocked me. And it was about the first time my mother like beat the heck out of me, on the floor, kicking, biting, pinching kind of fight. I tell that little story in the book. But at that moment, even though I always thought I was going to write this story, here I am retired now from a wonderful teaching career because it was my teachers all during my childhood who empowered me. My teachers were angel teachers. And now, as I look at the research on childhood trauma and resilience, all it really takes is one trusted adult mentor to make a difference in a kid's life. I feel like I had many. Every year, I felt that the teacher was there for me, I felt capable, I felt safe at school, all of that. Anyway, that's a huge part, not only of my story, but of how I turned out okay. Um, because I was strong, Beverly, when I was at school, at church. I was kind of weak, Beverly, at home because I I didn't know how to behave at with this onslaught of angry words and angry actions. Anyway, when I finally get to writing it, I've gone through wonderful counseling. At one point, I mean, I did not treat my childhood trauma for 20 years because I thought I was just fine. Strong Beverly took over. I got all these degrees. I got a college teaching position. I was a great teacher. Everything. I even bought a house. I'd never even lived in a house. So, life was good. When my mother died, I fell apart in 1983. That's when I sought help. So I've got my head screwed on pretty decently now. And so when I finally get to writing it, I'm not writing it like I would write it right after I left. I'm writing it from a different perspective, hopefully wiser, hopefully being able to understand that all of these 5 people are complex people, and I have to look at them differently. I have to try to show some compassion. I'd long ago forgiven my mother, and sort of forgiven my father, but you have to go through all of that. So I wrote it intentionally with trying to achieve tone. And the tone was, this is not going to be a Mama Dearest book. And I do not want the reader to feel sorry for the narrator. And I also tried to underwrite the violence of the home, even though I tried to show it, with some examples. I did underwrite it. Some of my readers don't think I achieved that third goal, but nevertheless, I think I achieved the goal of trying to write about these players from a compassionate, mature view. So while I spent a lot of time reliving things like the fight, and every scene, you have to relive it to see it again. And it's that imagery that you're trying to capture and show. The way I wrote the book is, people say to me, I read it. It sounded like a novel, and I couldn't put it down. Sort of like, hey, this is what I was trying to do. I don't tell them that, but it makes me feel like I might have achieved my goal, to use the tools of the fiction writer while I was writing nonfiction. So I was able, I think, to write this from not a point of frenzy or
Yeah. You mentioned a few things there that I want to unpack, but the first is you went 20 years without sort of treating, this trauma, and how strong Beverly took over. And I love this dichotomy between strong Beverly and weak Beverly. What were the signals to you later on in life that, what, I really do need to address this? Like, what were some signs that that you could share with us?
Oh, well, when you write a memoir, you just have to tell the truth. So I'm not afraid of saying, I had all kinds of signs that one of the ways I coped as a kid was to hide all my emotions, to press everything down, and to be a tough girl. And I kept doing that for those 20 years. But I had nightmares. I imagined she was going to find me and kill me. I was petrified. I never went back home. I never physically faced her. I lost contact with my half brothers. I was tormented by that. I felt guilty about running away from home. I felt responsible for her and for my brothers. So I had all of that torment going on. I had a serious eating disorder that I developed in my childhood that stayed with me for those 20 years. And I knew I was in trouble. Was it Karen Carpenter died
Sure.
right about that time? And I was freaked out. So, like, God, people die from doing these things that I'm doing. And so I was full of clues that I did a great job of carrying on my coping strategy and just hiding it all.
Yeah. Did it impact your any romantic relationships later in life?
Oh God, yes. Excuse me. My social relationships were totally affected. And I ruined so many good boyfriends these relationships, you know, like I did not, I did really not want to make a commitment. Deep down, I was frightened of that. I was frightened somebody would see the eating problem. I was just frightened because who knows why, but it's part of this complex of mess I was really in. Yeah, I may, and in retrospect, I didn't think it at the time, but in retrospect, it was my behavior that messed up these relationships. I mean, I never did marry. I never did have a child. Um, it's part of the debris. Um, I think from those first 23 years uh,
Sure.
of my life.
The other thing you mentioned, and I love how you put it, was that this wasn't a hit piece. Like you weren't writing this memoir to get back at anybody, and I think that's really important because I think there is a tendency in all of us human beings to try and seek kind of justice for the ways we've been wronged. But
Yes.
you said something very important to me, which is you forgave your mother. I'm curious, like, why was forgiveness of your mother so important to you, and then how did your life change after you were able to forgive your mother?
I'll tell you, you have to do that for yourself. It was when I sought psychological help, I found the best. He was a psychiatrist who acted like a psychologist. You know, he. I told him this story briefly, so he had the elements, and he's the one who helped me kind of see that I had to forgive her, and not only forgive her, I, as the oldest child, had to be responsible for burying my mother. My mother was in a kind of a no person's spot in the crematorium, and my half brother didn't know what to do or how to do it. So I orchestrated getting the remains, and I physically had the remains with me in Atlanta, and brought them to my psychologist's office. And it was around that box of remains that he had me role play Beverly and my mother. There were two chairs and the box in the middle. And I had to talk to my mother. And excuse me, and I had to become my mother and talk to little Beverly. Uh, that was when I knew I had to say, I forgive you. I forgive you. It's okay. And when she said to me, I never intended my life to turn out this way. I'm sorry. And I heard that, even though I was saying it. I heard it. And, I there's a burden that lifts from you at that point. I am so taken by people like Edith Eger. I don't know if you know about her. She's written a number of books, one called The Choice. She was in a concentration camp, and her whole family died. She was just a child. And she came out of that, came to the States, became a psychologist, and worked with people who had trauma, especially veterans coming back from a site. And she says to them, you can choose happiness. You can choose forgiveness. You can choose to forgive yourself for surviving when your best friend is lying on the battlefield. You can choose to do that. And by doing that, you become free. She actually went back to Poland. She forgave Hitler. Now, if somebody can do that, I can forgive my mother.
Wow.
But
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. And we're both getting teared up over that story. This is
yeah,
this
yeah,
episode of Uncorking a Story is brought to you by Kleenex. Um,
yeah,
if only,
exactly.
if only. You know what I'm curious about, Beverly? You
Here's one.
mentioned, yeah, take it, please. You mentioned, there's just a few things there. You know, our parents, like, I just turned 50 last August, and you know, I see the world clearly through a different lens than I did when I was younger, being raised by my parents, and now that I'm, you know, the father of three 23-year-olds, you know, I have much more empathy for the things that they went through. And, you know, I look back and, you know, I've spent some time on the therapist couch before, you know,
It's a
talking
good thing.
about, you know, because they always get into your childhood. I'll talk about your childhood. And mine was not nearly as traumatic as yours. But I think, like, as we age and as we mature, we are able to, I think we can forgive more because we see it through the eyes of our own experience. And I think that's important to recognize too, that these people who raised you were imperfect beings, just as imperfect as we are. And you know, um and that's just one reflection I had on that. But you know, you mentioned like writing a poem and you're not really sure where that poem came from. I'm curious, was your mother still alive when you wrote that poem?
No, no. She died when I was 40, 42. And I didn't actually write my story until I hate to tell you how old I am, until I was like in my in my 70s. And the book Seeing Eye Girl was actually, you know, it's all in the book. Everybody knows. So I'll tell you, the book was published. I was 81. I'm 84 now, and I'm writing another book. And as long as I am upright and the brain sort of works, I'm going to keep on keeping on. But you know, so by being like in my 60s and 70s and thinking about writing a book, I hope I had that perspective that you're talking about, where you can see your own life in a new light, and you can see, you know, your parents in a new light. You know, I really do believe, you know, most of them try. You know, they're doing their best at any particular time. And you know, as I look at my mother's life, there she had lots of trauma too that molded her uh, in certain ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I was curious about the poem because you mentioned you didn't know where it came from, and I'm wondering, you know, there's something writers experience, and I certainly have experienced this, where you're almost doing automatic writing, where you're not really sure where the idea comes from. Your hands are moving, and you get it down, then you reread it, and you're like, I have no idea. I don't even remember writing that, and that's happened to me a few times, and that really is, I believe, it's a gift from the universe. But it seems like that poem was the catalyst for you to really start thinking about writing your story.
You know, like envisioning the box, you know, brought me to tears a minute ago. Exactly right. I wrote this poem in a writing class to the prompt hair. And what came out of me from deep inside of me that I had suppressed was this image of being 7 years old and, you know, piddling all over the floor because she's kicking me and, and pulling my hair and, and wiping the floor with me a mop. after I wrote it, the teacher wanted people to read what they wrote. And, I couldn't read it. My voice was cracking. And one of my friends in the class read it out loud for me. And, becoming so emotional kind of brought a little emotion back to the fore. And I realized I've got a story. I need to tell that story, not because it's my story, but because the story belongs to so many people. Mine is like a case study of growing up in chaos and trauma. You know the numbers. It's still going on. This is not something that happened in the 50s and 60s. So my story is like a case study, an example. And it's also an example of the importance of mentors. Because a kid who's being sexually or physically abused, if they don't have somebody to help them emotionally, have a little hope that tomorrow's going to be a better day, and find ways to make tomorrow a better day, then that kid just might be lost for an awfully long time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Beverly, this has been a powerful conversation. I'm curious if people want to learn more about you, Beverly. Do you have a website or any social media that you want to share?
Oh, I sure do. My website is simply BeverlyArmentoAuthor.com. And on the website, you'll find links to my Facebook, and there's a YouTube station. Since the book was published in 2022, I've done quite a bit of speaking to different groups. So there's some films on YouTube of presentations that I've made recently. But the website is full of things that I've written, podcasts. I'll put this one up there, so that people can kind of get a sense of who I am. And hopefully, if you're so inclined, you'll pick up a book.
Yeah, well, I will put links to the book and to your YouTube and website in our show notes so people can easily find those.
Thanks, Mike.
And I will say, Beverly, thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, Mike. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.